Yeah, what's a nice girl like me? Uh, thinking and writing and working in this kind of um,
Mhm.
space. Well, I had no desire at all to do anything with pornography or, you know, in this space at all. But I moved to a new town. I met a woman. She had a large family. And she called me up one night and told me about her 17-year-old son, her oldest child, who they found out was sexually molesting his younger brothers and sisters. So from the 14-year-old all the way down to the 4-year-old. He didn't get to the 2-year-old. Um, and and pornography was
Mm.
involved. And so I woke up the next morning and I just thought, what can be, I just had this thought like beating in my mind like a drum, like what can be done to warn young children before they get involved into
Mm.
pornography and have these terrible outcomes because this young man had to be separated from his parents, his family. And thankfully, there was a program for him here in Washington
Mm.
state. Not every state has that. And, but there were really some bad outcomes for some of the other kids in the family. So, um, anyway, I looked, tried to find a book because I thought, well, I'll buy a
Mhm.
book because I have this belief that, there's a book for every problem, right? And, or many. And so I thought, oh, there'll be a bunch of books on pornography and why it's bad for kids and especially. And so I was looking and I couldn't find
Mhm.
anything. And I started to do some research and I came to the conclusion rather quickly that this wasn't rocket science. It might be brain science, but it could be boiled down for a young child, 6, 7-year-old child, to start to warn them about some of the things they might run into on the internet and how to
Mhm.
respond when they see those things. So that gave me the idea that, when I couldn't find the book, I thought I'm going to write it myself. And I thought I could do it over the summer in a few weeks, but it took 3 years of research and
Mm.
testing and
Mm.
rewriting. But as soon as it came on, became a number one bestseller on Amazon. And then I then I was asked by parents to write a book for younger kids. So good pictures, bad pictures, porn proofing today's young kids is for kids ages 7 to 11 in
Mhm.
there. Although I've heard parents use it for older kids. Um, but then I wrote one, Good Pictures, Bad Pictures Junior, A Simple Plan to Protect Young Minds. That's a read aloud book as
Mhm.
well for kids ages 3 to 6, 7, 8. Uh, and, I've read them to my own grandsons. So um, they just begin this conversation in a very comfortable
Mhm.
way so that parents can start that conversation, which ultimately is going to be very helpful and protective for their kids.
Excellent. I think there's a lot to unpack here. The I think one of the so in some ways, this is nothing new. We were talking about this a little bit before, in that there's been erotic content through different media, really throughout human history. I mean, you can find, old statues, right, from tens of thousands of years ago, but things have changed in terms of digitization of content, access, all that kind of stuff. And so, speaking personally, this wasn't much of a discussion that I had with my parents growing up, but clearly there's this growing need that's being recognized by folks, including your customers, especially who are reading, buying, using the book. And it sounds like it started with um, you having some intuition or noticing that there was a link between consumption of adult content at an early age, especially, and then that moving from the online world to having these really devastating, sort of catastrophic consequences in the real world. So that link, I was wondering if you could unpack that a little bit, either in the context of what you had observed that got you started, or maybe more generally.
Yeah. So Definitely. Well, just to go back to the books, I just want to say that there are three
Mhm.
purposes, just to start
Yeah.
off with, in the books. And that is to give kids a definition so they recognize it, but an age appropriate definition, to give kids a warning so they have a reason to reject it, and to give kids a plan so they know exactly what to do when they see it. So a definition, a warning, and a plan. And those are three things that are in both books, both good pictures, bad pictures books. Now, you talked about how this exposing children to
Mhm.
pornography at a young
Mhm.
age is doesn't just stay in the digital world. It definitely bleeds over to the physical world. And I want you to think about children when they are young, they imitate adults. They have an abundance of what we call mirror neurons that help children imitate. That's part of the reason. There's other things that mirror neurons do, but part of the thing is they help children imitate, and every parent will definitely recognize this in their children. They see them want, little children like to help, you know, play with play vacuums or play with, follow their parent around with a play or a toy lawnmower. They like to imitate um, the actions of adults and also the phrases and the language and things. So we know this is true, and this is how children develop. What happens with pornography is when they watch pornography, they have unfortunately unprecedented access to it. And then they begin to, many of them have a normal, natural, biological kind of push to imitate that behavior in a physical way. And so they will find someone with who is more vulnerable, younger, usually a younger child in their family, in their neighborhood, and practice what they've seen. And so this can have, like you said, devastating results on the family. Depending on the state you live
Mhm.
in, this child on child harmful sexual behavior um, can get a child registered on a sex offender list for
Mm.
life. Um, they can go to juvie. There may not be any programs for them. Just it's the luck of the draw, depending on what state you live
Mhm.
in. Um, one of the children in this family that I just talked about, um, he grew up and they found out that at the age of 21, he was offending on his very youngest sister. And he went to jail for that for 6 years, and there's no treatment in that state. So not only that, just the devastation it has on the family relationships and the stressor and all that. So, we talk about how pornography can become an addiction, and that is really also has terrible, ramifications. But when you think about children acting out on other children in a sexual way, this can be so harmful, and just go on for years and years and years. That a lifetime of kind of pain and you know
Yeah,
difficulty.
I mean, I'm horrified even thinking about, the case that you just described. I guess the to if I were listening to this right now as a parent or really anybody, I think the assumption sort of in the culture right now is pornography is everywhere. It's ubiquitous. There's some other stuff we can get into in terms of it being protected as free speech. Like, well, those are some bigger questions we can kind of get to in a second. But if I were hearing this, I might immediately react and say, well, that sounds like an extreme case. I've been exposed to porn and I didn't go down that path. So, what would you say to somebody uh, who's maybe not, um, quite convinced that this might be an issue? Is there any data or
Right.
yeah.
And sure, I get that. And I understand that. Well, I'll tell you this. About 4 years ago, my team and we helped to sponsor, along with the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, um, and others, we helped to sponsor a symposium about child on child harmful sexual behavior in Washington, D.C. And many people came to that from the military because they were finding, and this was in the news too, that this is a huge problem on military bases, the child on child harmful sexual
Mm,
behavior. And so you wanted studies and backing those up. So they there's a report in that was done a few years back in England that found that 65% of child sexual abuse cases were committed by
mhm,
minors. 65%. So we generally think that children are being um, sexually abused by adults, and that definitely still happens. But it's
mm,
shifting. It's shifting to children acting out sexually on other children. And and we're not just talking about, you know, a 16-year-old and a 17-year-old, having sex consensually. We're talking about, forced and rape, basically. So um another uh data point I guess I could give you is that there's a hospital in Kansas, and the sexual assault nurse examiner, manager, her name is Heidi Olson, by the way. She she started to see these correlations between the kids that were coming in, um, and the perpetrators being involved in
mhm,
porn. And also the fact that these kids, when they were perpetrated on, it was not kind of the normal sexual thing you might, like sexual exploration. It was definitely porn induced
mm,
acts that were being performed. So she started to do a study to document, you know, uh, the perpetrators. Basically, they would ask, the parent or whoever brought the
mm,
child in, who did this. And in the cases where they knew, and that usually was the case where they knew, um, they would find out. And what they found out is that the largest group of
mhm,
perpetrators were males between the ages of 11 and 15.
mm,
So, and again, they weren't just doing kind of normal things, they were doing porn induced acts. So, all of this, like, why is the largest group of perpetrators? Why is that 11 through 15-year-olds, males? There's a huge body of studies, a meta study that took 22 studies, pulled in all the data, analyzed it, and found that there's a huge correlation between males who watch pornography, and there's 6 times greater chance that they will actually act
mm.
out
Really?
sexually or, you know, aggressively, sexual aggression on women. So it there's just a lot of harms of children having access to pornography. It creates greater sexual aggression, and there's a lot of studies on that. I've just been reading a book by John Fober called "Protecting Your Children from Internet Pornography," and he goes through tons of studies on this and documents the harms of pornography. Um, for example, anal sex is a huge thing in pornography. We've seen the rise of anal sex in kids, um, and it's creating problems, especially in girls. They're having rectal damage, they're having higher amounts of rectal cancer. At young ages, that this shouldn't be happening. And they're starting to tie that to anal sex. So we know that, there are problems with this. We just haven't been seeing them in kids and tying them to pornography. But me and many, many others can see um, the connections that are made. And it's not like it's pretty reasonable.
Yeah.
Again, kids act out what they see
No,
adults
I
do.
mean, I think
That's
I
very
think the
normal.
first principles logic is pretty hard to argue with, right? Like kids are imitative, what they're gonna see, that would be reflected in the behavior. The stats you just shared, you said 6 times more likely, males are going to yeah.
Yes. So males that watch, especially violent
Mm,
porn, are 6 times more likely to act out sexually act out sexual aggression on women.
yeah.
So I can get you the actual
Yeah, we'll
study
include these in the show notes.
that's out of
Yeah.
Australia, um, and you can link to it. But there's also studies there's just so many studies that show that even men that look at porn are more likely to think that rape is not like they'll do a study that will say, well, in the crime of rape, how many years of jail time should you
Mhm.
serve? And or should perpetrators serve? And the more porn they watch, the lower the jail time.
Really?
Yeah. So that's an actual study. There's really a lot of irrefutable evidence about the the link between pornography and sexual
Mhm.
aggression. Very well documented. Not, it's not out there and popular, because no one wants to say that. It's just like nobody wanted to admit that cigarettes cause lung
Right.
cancer, smoking cigarettes, a big tobacco for a long time, denied
Mhm.
that. And it took thousands and thousands and thousands of studies before, you know, it caught the attention of the
Yep.
CDC, and they had the hearings, and then they put the warnings on and they wouldn't let them advertise, you know, uh, and certain play like on television. So there's, we're getting
Mhm.
there. We're getting there.
So can I play devil's advocate on just one point with the let's say like some of the studies that show the link between aggression and pornography consumption. How is it? And this might be something where we have to link to the studies or is not available at the moment. But the how do we know that there's a causal link as opposed to maybe somebody who's more aggressive is going to be consuming
Correlation.
more pornography?
I've pulled together this 5 ways porn harms kids research
Hmm.
guide probably about 5 years ago. So this is not actually new
Hmm.
research. Here's one thing: kids emulate what they have seen done in porn. The impact of pornography on young people's sexual behavior has been most well documented with regard to anal intercourse. Anal intercourse is routine and representations of heterosexual sex in contemporary pornography, with various studies finding its inclusion in 15 to 42% of the scenes. 5 studies among Swedish young people find that young men who are regular consumers of pornography are more likely to have had anal intercourse with a girl and to have tried to perform acts they have seen in pornography, and that girls who have seen pornography also are more likely to have anal intercourse. This is Michael Flood from 2016. And then it actually can serve as what I say rape training. Quote, there is consistent evidence that exposure to pornography is related to male sexual aggression against girls and women. The body of evidence demonstrating this link is overwhelming, with no fewer than 3 meta analyses now available. Again, Michael Flood. Um, a new meta analysis of pornography use and actual sexual aggression again demonstrates reliably, indeed undeniably, that pornography use increases the likelihood of perpetrating sexual aggression. This meta analysis of 22 studies from 7 countries, comprising over 20,000 participants, finds consistent evidence that pornography consumption is associated with acts of sexual aggression in both cross sectional and longitudinal studies. In a recent longitudinal study of US youth aged 10 to 15, with 3 waves of data over 3 years, individuals who intentionally consumed violent X rated materials were over 6 times as likely as others to engage in sexually aggressive
Mhm.
behavior. After controlling for other potential influences on the association, individuals who saw X rated materials in which a person was being physically hurt by another person while doing something sexual were still twice as likely to report sexually aggressive behavior in the past year.
So it sounds like then both things, there's both a correlative, like there's an association and maybe some lurking variable, which is you might this is somebody for whatever reason is just more aggressive, and so they're more likely to pursue this kind of content, but also act out in real life. But then the last part I heard is there because of it, there's this kind of reinforcing potentially like the hypothesis would be that the content is reinforcing the offline behavior to the point that did you say they were twice as likely when controlling?
Yeah, they were still so after
Yeah.
controlling for other potential
Yep.
influences, right? They were still twice as likely to report sexually aggressive behavior in the past. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody that watches violent porn is going to go out and be violent, but you start to accept because in pornography, women look like they're enjoying this behavior. They're enjoying being choked, gagged, and many
Yeah.
other uh, pretty despicable acts. And so young men get this idea that, well, this is what women want. This is what they expect. This is what they
Mhm.
like. It's not, it doesn't take, I'm not the brightest candle on the cake, but I can figure that
Yeah.
out. I can see the connection, why this would happen. And you hear a lot of anecdotal stories of men that were choking women. And when they got charged, they're like, well, I thought she would like that. Hmm,
Right.
maybe not. So there are just so many studies, and but they don't get out. A lot of these don't get out in mainstream because they're not the narrative.
Yeah.